You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Claudio joining you. It is the 1st of July. Happy July, everybody. You may be listening to this on the 2nd. Maybe you're listening to this on the weekend. 4th is either happening or has happened. We've been trying to... Summer's a little slow when it comes to a podcast that primarily covers college sports. We've done a lot about college sports and NIL. We did a nice pod with Taylor Lehman the other day about IU football recruiting updates, and then IU recruited another player, got one commit today, 3-star defensive lineman out of IMG Academy. We're doing some other things throughout the course of the summer to keep you, the listener of the Back Home Network, entertained. And we're happy to have back on the pod. It's been like 7 years, I think.
I was going to say, I remember doing it at like 2 apartments ago, I think. Yeah, we're back. You were waiting for the right time.
I was.
Mid-2025.
This was definitely the right time. But Greg Gottfried joining us. Greg, for those who don't know who you are, tell the people.
I don't know where to start. I went to IU, so that's good. I graduated in 2017 from the journalism school. I mean, do you need the whole background? I work for Golf.
What do you like?
I work for Golf Digest right now. I've been there since end of 2019, right before COVID, end of 2019. And I'm a web producer. I produce our 3 podcasts. I write for the website. And then I also write about movies in my spare time. And I live in New York City, so I have no money whatsoever. So yeah, that's who I am.
Living the dream.
Honestly, yesterday I went, this is the most like humble braggy thing, but I pay a lot of money for Equinox to go to the gym there. And it's over $200. Whatever, who cares anymore? But my AC at the gym was broken. Okay. So they let me go to any other Equinox. So I went to one with a pool, took a pool class. It was me and 12 52-year-old women. And then I went to a movie and I picked up a wrap in between. And I walked back at like 9:30 at night, and it truly was the dream. I love it here.
Things you could only do in New York City, right?
No other place has gym, movies, or pools.
Nothing.
So,
none of that.
Yeah, no.
It's really the walk that matters more than anything else.
Right through Central Park. Yeah. Where they find bodies every so often. It's perfect.
They find bodies everywhere. It's not just Central Park.
Yeah, but it's New York bodies, you know?
So Greg and I have texted regularly for a long time. We keep each other humored, I guess, just with the random stuff that we'll see in relation to sports and media. But we got to talking quite a bit the other day about a topic that I know is relevant and interesting to a lot of the folks that are in our listening audience, which is what the hell happened to ESPN? This became, I think, exacerbated for a lot of people in Indiana over the course of the last couple of months because of the Pacers' somewhat improbable but incredibly exciting run all the way to Game 7 of the NBA Finals. And so we got to going back and forth talking about a few things. And I think at one point I said, we should do a podcast where you just ask me a bunch of questions. Because I think one of the things that's worth noting is that, Greg, what generation do you consider yourself a part of? Are you a millennial or are you Gen Z?
No, I'm millennial. I'm part of the generation of Grantland. I feel like when I was in high school, that's when Grantland came out, and Page 2 was, I feel like, closing shop, and I feel like that's where my generation is. I feel like with the ESPN thing.
That's fair. So I'm at the exact opposite end of the millennial spectrum, to the point that I'm probably technically Gen X, but I refuse to identify with Gen X for personal reasons.
Yeah.
But it's interesting having conversations about ESPN, because the perception of what ESPN should be and what it actually is in practice is, I think, very distinctly different things in most cases. And I happen to be a professor of sports media in my day job, so I think about these things all the time. And so this is where the basis of this conversation on text started, and we were like, why don't we do this as a podcast? Since, as the listeners know, or the viewers on YouTube, everything in my life is essentially a podcast at this point. And so, let's just live it and let's share in this with everybody. And Greg did a great job of coming up with a lot of questions that are probably on the minds of you folks out there. So we're going to get to those in just a second. But first of all, quick reminder, we are here at CrimsonCast, part of the Back Home Network, which is brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. Why are you laughing right now?
No, it's just you're doing it on air. I mean, I guess that's what you have to do with the YouTube thing. But sorry, you finish up and then
we don't do live. We don't do like pre-recorded drops.
We drop everything in.
I think those are soulless and they're like zombie ads at that point.
They are, but when you're trying to wrangle a bunch of different hosts together, it's like just do it on your own at home.
This is why I produce all of my own stuff. It just makes it much easier. But anyway,
continue.
Home Field also produces all of their own stuff. T-shirts, hoodies. They've got this whole ball cap series that's coming out, which is really an impressive thing if you are a fan of any of the teams that they've released, which I don't happen to be, but you might be. You might want a Penn State hat or a Michigan hat or a Purdue hat. I can't imagine why. But you can go to Home Field Apparel and use the code HOME23. Get 15% off your first order. They will have a ton of things coming out in the fall. College football is their jam. They've got some exciting new things that they're planning on doing, both with their merch and with some other items. So head on over, follow them on socials, get subscribed to their newsletter or their text updates. You'll get the things that you're interested in sent right to you. Again, that's homefieldapparel.com. And just a quick reminder, we are on Substack. Subscribe to the Substack. You get the podcast delivered right to your inbox. And that includes our YouTube, which you can separately subscribe to. And we would recommend that you do so. Get alerts about when we're doing live shows and when new things drop on YouTube. We'd love to have you as part of that community. All right, Greg, I'm going to do something I don't normally do. I'm going to move you to the left on the video.
That's my good side, so that works perfectly.
For those of you who are on YouTube or Spotify, Greg has now moved to the left side. So I am more in if this was $25,000 pyramid, I would be receiving as opposed to giving, which in $25,000.
You're dating yourself. That's what I was about to say.
You ever watched an episode of that?
I think when I was sick, home from school.
Fair enough.
It was never because that was an 8 p.m. show, right? At one point. It was
I really only ever, actually, it's funny you say that. I would come home from school and it would be on CBS at 4 p.m. when I was a kid. But I mostly knew it from the Game Show Network.
That's what I was gonna. That's where I know it from.
Well, I don't know when it ran on the Game Show Network. It's in a weird spot historically in game shows because I think uniformly we would say in some order the best game show, the most recognized game show is either Price is Right or Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune, right?
Yeah.
Is there anybody else that's even close to those three?
No, it's Jeopardy. Jeopardy's the show, and maybe it's less.
I don't know, man. When I think game show, I think Price is Right. I don't know that anything has quite the combo of flash and consistency as Price is Right has.
It's funny you say game show, and my first thought was Jeopardy, and my second thought was Guts and the other Nickelodeon game shows growing up. There was
Double Dare.
Double Dare. There was the Temple, the Hidden Legends of the Hidden Temple.
Legends of the Hidden Temple, yeah.
Which was I wanted to be on that show so badly.
This is very much the difference between growing up in the early 2000s, mid 2000s.
Early mid 2000s. Yeah,
and growing up in the 80s and early 90s, when for me it was Price is Right, Card Sharks, that was a big one. Classic Concentration, which was a bizarre show hosted by Alex Trebek. There were a few others in the mix like that that I would place above the other ones that you mentioned, even the Nickelodeon ones. But I was always an old head, even as a kid, though. So
that's not shocking, considering the record collection I've seen you have and other things like that. Yeah,
correct. Anyway, we've gotten off topic already. We should talk about Stump the Schwab, I guess, as maybe a transition point for game shows.
Which I watched. I did watch that one.
Where would you rank that on the list of game shows conceptually and executionally?
I feel like I got into it a little late, but I got obsessed with it. I feel like when I really got into sports, middle school, early high school, it was always on ESPN2 or ESPN News or all these random back channels. And I thought it was cool knowing who this guy was that no one else in my class knew. So that's my Schwab. background. But I mean, he was great. I know he has some weird takes outside of. I feel like there was a whole backstory to Schwab.
There was a whole cancel the Schwab period of things, which kind of fits into the story that we're about to paint here.
You're so good at this. You keep getting it right back. I keep trying to get you off, and then you're like, and by the way, let's segue right back into the perfect. I mean,
you got to find these angles, man. You know, you podcast for 20 years about everything. You'll eventually hit these things too. But it's fun because like there was a whole cadre of quirky, offbeat types of shows that ESPN launched in like the 90s and 2000s, which I think for most people that corresponds with what they would consider the golden era of ESPN. So it wasn't just like Stump the Schwab, which was a weird show, but it was a show that was like, it had a purpose to it. Dream Job was another one that had a great first season, a hideous second season, which you could actually make an argument maps the entire history of ESPN's bad decision making. But even things like Cheap Seats, where they literally just stuck the Sklar brothers in like a closet and had them watch old films and make fun of people, like Mystery Science Theater 3000.
They were just trying things.
Yeah.
I feel like that's what we're talking about. I mean, that's basically the background to this whole thing is they're not trying things anymore, or the things that they're trying just aren't interesting to me, and it seems like you for the most part.
Right. Well, and this is where as we paint the picture of ESPN, a lot of people complained bitterly and like across the spectrum of American sports consumership, at least what we see on social media, which I think in this case actually might be pretty representative of how people feel in general, that ESPN's coverage of the NBA, particularly the NBA playoffs and the NBA finals, ESPN's coverage of baseball, ESPN's coverage of hockey, like everything just feels incredibly lacking and almost insulting to some degree if you happen to be a fan of sports beyond the very, very base casual, I recognize that those people are in uniform kind of level. And it does kind of feel like the things that they are trying are not really on the networks anymore. There's some interesting stuff on ESPN Plus. Like I do like some of the things they've done with Omaha Productions, but they've kind of settled into this weird pattern where they've started things and then they've killed them. Yeah. And then they've started new things and they've killed them again. But those are all kind of the satellites in orbit around the star, and the star is the real issue, and that is what's on their linear programming. And their linear programming has descended into a kind of a hellscape from a sports perspective that I don't think anybody anticipated, but that kind of maps what happened in political television with CNN, with CNBC or MSNBC, with Fox, where it's just a bunch of people yelling at each other to no great purpose. And it almost feels like it's actively attacking the people who are trying to tune in for the actual news and commentary and information that they want to get.
Yeah.
So that's the backdrop of what we're talking about here.
Well, there was a 30 Rock episode, I remember, where Tracy Jordan was on, was it called Sports Yelling or whatever? And at the time it was making fun of Around the Horn. But I feel like if you watched it now, it'd almost be like relaxing compared to a lot of the ESPN programming, which, to be honest, I mean, I know you invited me on this ESPN breakdown podcast. I can't watch anymore. Like, there's no reason to. I don't find it entertaining, especially once you get rid of Zach Lowe. Like, I don't care about your NBA,
right? Any
of your programming just surrounding it. I can't do the Stephen A. Smith thing, which is every single thing on ESPN. Everything. I can't do the Kendrick Perkins thing. I don't think anyone can do the Kendrick Perkins thing. And like the only person left really is Scott Van Pelt. I feel like that's the only guy that I really find myself gravitating to, at least on the TV side. I mean, I know there's Mina Kimes and a few others here and there, but I just don't find it entertaining. And I know some of it is me being biased or picky or whatever, however you want to say it, but a lot of my friends feel the same way, and a lot of people I know.
I don't know if it's biased or picky. I mean, it'd be one thing if it were just old people complaining, because that's, as we know, that's what old people do, is they complain. You're not old. Congratulations. I mean, you're not. And,
yeah.
I mean, here's the thing. I think what's important to keep in mind, like when ESPN was at its zenith from a cultural cool perspective, you're talking about that period really between 1994 and 2008, let's say, about a 15-year period of time.
Yeah.
And the audience was not young people. I mean, there were young people that loved it, but their core audience was people who were kind of in between where you are. I mean, what are you, 29 right now?
29. Yep.
And my age, I'm 45. I mean, so like that kind of window there between your late 20s and your mid 40s, where you're still tuned into the zeitgeist, you're still tuned into what's going on, you're a fan of sports, you're buying tickets, you're going to games when you can, you're watching games regularly. Like that was ESPN's core audience. And it's weird that so many people in that particular audience very much share the opinion that you have, where they don't watch anymore. It's like, it's not for me. And I agree. It's like, you know, the Scott Van Pelt Sports Center and what he does with hosting various things just sticks out in such a fascinating way, because it is so clearly of another era than what ESPN is doing right now with all of their shows. And, you know, so you look through the, you know, conceptually what we're talking about in terms of, say, the Zach Lowe thing. So let's start there. So ESPN, you know, they went out and they bought a bunch of talent from various places. You know, they bring Zach Lowe in and they make him kind of the centerpiece of their intellectual coverage of basketball. And they've got other people. And I will say it's not just Scott Van Pelt that sticks out as kind of not belonging within the mix. I think Brian Windhorst has developed into that kind of a guy. I think Tim Legler has, you know, been pretty good in that spectrum. They've got some other anchors that I like. Like I will always, if I've got ESPN on and SportsCenter comes on and Nicole Briscoe is hosting, I will watch Nicole Briscoe hosting SportsCenter. I just think she might be one of my top 5 favorite broadcasters across the board right now in sports media. But so much of their sports-specific coverage has become about debate, and it has become about opinions that don't really have nuance, aren't grounded in anything. They're grounded, well, they're not really, like I said, they're not grounded in anything, but they're focused so much on a very surface-level perception of what a casual sports fan or someone who doesn't really love sports but loves the idea of a city or the idea of fandom might be interested in talking about. And the weird thing is, like, it's across all of their sports, but it hits the hardest with their NBA coverage. And when I think about Zach Lowe, like Zach Lowe represents to some degree exactly the wrong kind of content for ESPN, in that there's nuance involved. If you listen to his podcast, which I do pretty regularly now, like, and this has been the case even when he had a podcast at ESPN, he's not making a lot of crazy proclamations. He's a good interviewer. He has a lot of interesting thoughts, but they're always grounded in his reporting. And that's not what you're getting out of Stephen A. Smith. It's not what you're getting certainly out of Kendrick Perkins. It's not what you're getting out of a lot of these guys who are, you know, on their coverage. And even the people that they have where you do feel like they might be able to contribute in some positive way, the formatting with which they do these shows doesn't showcase the good things that those people have to say. And this is something we've heard Bill Simmons complain about. It's something we heard Steele complain about it. It's not just like a white male perspective. It's like everything is so overproduced and so short and so segmented that it ends up that nuance and depth are the first things to go with most of the things that are on their linear programming, and that's unfortunate.
You almost can't blame Stephen A. I mean, you can, and we will, but you can't get mad at them when they have 30 seconds to do a halftime show, and it's like we come back, we see 2, quick highlights of usually the Lakers, and then Stephen A. will say something inane, something random about how this player isn't playing up. I mean, Simmons does the whole step up thing, which at this point feels like he just wants to say players should step up. But Stephen A. will say this player needs to step up, whatever. And then Perkins will say, I don't know, they yell at each other for 45 seconds and then they send it to a break again. Malika Andrews will send it to a break. They'll do that one more time and then the game starts again. And at this point, just show more ads. You don't even have to have I don't think anyone's satisfied. Like, I can't imagine ESPN's themselves are satisfied. I can't imagine the NBA is satisfied. Like, I don't get the point of any of that.
This is where I'm not totally sure. I mean, if it was something that the NBA hated, we know that they would do something about it. I mean, famously, the first year that ESPN got the NBA contract in whatever it was, 2002, they had Brad Nessler as their lead play-by-play guy, and David Stern went nuts behind the scenes, screamed at every executive at ESPN, and I think they hired Marv Albert to come in and do play-by-play that next year.
I know David Stern had his critics, and he deserved them, rest in peace or whatever. But at least it felt like he cared about the game more than Adam Silver does. And you can't tell me that the NBA product looks better now. I mean, it does TV wise in terms of graphics and cameras and all that. But in terms of it mattering, you watch a 2013 or a 2008 highlight clip and it just looks better. I mean, maybe I'm being insane, but it looks like a better product. There's more gravitas to the whole thing. It feels like there's energy that there just isn't anymore.
It's weird because I used to feel that way, and then my team made it to the finals this year, and I didn't feel that way anymore. And I will say the in-person experience was pretty incredible.
You felt that at the game, not
and that's what I mean. It's it's there. It's not being captured particularly well. I went to multiple Pacers games. I went to a finals, to two of the finals games. I went to game 3 and I went to game 6. And the energy was off the charts. The one I didn't go to was game 4. And it was shocking how muted the broadcast was in relation to everything else. And so, when I think about it, I'm just kind of there's something off in terms of the way that the presentation is happening. And, I think TNT was not having similar problems with their game broadcasts. I thought that their coverage of Pacers Knicks was really good. And it wasn't just obviously the game broadcast itself. It was also the inside the NBA and their overall coverage surrounding the games. And it's an interesting contrast because that contrast isn't going to exist anymore because there is no more TNT NBA coverage. There's no more inside the NBA. And the NBA felt perfectly happy with jumping into bed with ESPN for most of it. And then NBC, who notoriously does a bad job, in my opinion, of making their coverage not look fake. Yeah. If you look at Sunday Night Football, it seems so inorganic next to what CBS and Fox do with their coverage, in my opinion. But that may be kind of the heart of some of the issue with the Stephen A. shtick. It feels forced to a ridiculous extreme. There's always been this struggle, and I know that you had a question about this later, but the whole concept of ESPN taking over inside the NBA.
Yep.
And why they haven't been able to duplicate that, despite throwing the kitchen sink at NBA coverage in particular. They've tried so many different people and so many different formats. And they had Magic Johnson and Bill Simmons and Sage Steele and a bunch of people that I've lost track of over the course of time. And it never works. And, and it's interesting because Simmons always blames the producers. And I think that there's something to be said for that because I don't know that the ESPN producers and whether they're doing this on their own accord or whether they're doing this because of orders that are coming down from up high, just don't know what they're doing. But the concern I guess I have with the whole process is that there's a lack of organic conversation. There's a lack of flow, even in the game broadcasts. And this is where it's I didn't think Reggie Miller was a good commentator, and I don't really like listening to Stan Van Gundy talk. But even that kind of awkward pairing with Brian Anderson was miles better than what we got out of any of the games with Breen, Doris Burke, and Richard Jefferson. And I don't even know if we can blame them because, again, it's if your studio shows feel stilted and inorganic and forced, then your game broadcasts also feel that way. It's probably not the broadcaster's fault. It's probably the production orders that they're running with. And this is something that feels like it extends to a bunch of different areas of the ESPN, family of content.
I have 1,000 points / questions off of that.
Go off.
This could be the first 12-hour podcast. Let's start with the broadcast itself.
Yeah.
Am I losing my mind, or was Doris Burke better? She used to be good, right? I don't want to attack her. I mean, Richard Jefferson also is annoying. But like Doris Burke, I feel like 5 years ago, I was in the bag for her. I was obsessed with. I was like, this person knows what she's talking about. She is funny. She's interesting. And maybe it's just the combination of people they had. But it just didn't work at all, where it felt like they were attacking each other to get points across. It felt like they didn't really care about the games in a way that they were like just trying to push it to the end in some ways. There were so many times, I mean, we talked about, I think this may have been the impetus for this whole thing, was Rick Carlisle yelling at the refs and them saying, oh, he's upset, but then never saying what he was upset about,
right,
why he was upset, why he was annoyed. And then they just let it go. And you're like, this is the most important thing that's happened in the last 20 minutes. And we're going to get no information on this.
So it goes back to something you asked earlier, which was, does Adam Silver care about the game the same way that David Stern does? And I think he does, but I don't think he understands the presentation of the game, NBA wise, and what it means to be partnered with ESPN as your primary partner, as opposed to basically having them share the stage with Turner. Because what Turner always did really well was they presented the game respectfully, but they also presented the game in a style that was honest. And I feel like the problem with a lot of ESPN's coverage is it doesn't feel honest. It doesn't feel like it's coming from a place of joy or interest. And this is actually, I think, where I know a lot of Pacers fans got really frustrated with the way ESPN covered the games in the finals, because all ESPN seemed to want to talk about was either Shai Gilgeous-Alexander or how nobody was watching the finals in one way or another because they were small market teams. Like they were pining for something that wasn't there. There was no effort to build up the Pacers or the Thunder. I mean, Scott Van Pelt goes on his podcast and actually like issues a mea culpa. And it was like, well, we didn't see this team coming. We didn't build them up effectively. We didn't do our jobs, essentially, or at least he said he didn't do his. And it kind of it hits to a larger point in general. The Doris Burke thing is interesting because I do feel like her commentary has gotten less effective and less good because the NBA seems to think, well, we can't have people questioning the referees, which I agree with. Although I'll note, if you watch an NFL broadcast, people question the calls of the referees all the time, and it doesn't.
Collinsworth's gotten much better. I feel like he used to be much more safe, and he'll attack someone now. I mean, I know we were talking about NBC, but I think he's good. I mean, maybe it's just that everyone else has gotten a little worse just in general, but I think he knows what he's doing, and I respect when he makes a point, he really digs into it, and no one's doing that on ESPN. I feel like I was listening to Zach Lowe before too, and he was kind of not trashing, but like really annoyed, it seemed like, with LeBron and with LeBron's whole shtick in LA and trying to go somewhere else. And it felt genuine because he's not constantly attacking LeBron. At a certain point, Skip Bayless says LeBum, and you're like, well, this is just, he needs to put out a tweet today. He needs to do something. And Stephen A's like that too, where he's like attacking Tyrese or he's attacking Giannis or and it's just like, we know you're doing this for clicks. When Zach Lowe's doing it, it just feels like an organic thing that he's talking about, that he just is annoyed by this whole rigmarole of this whole thing, No, and I think it's a good point. And it does feel like so much of what happens with ESPN's content is very calculated. And I think that, I mean, there's always a certain degree of calculus in any sports broadcast or broadcasting in general. I mean, I work in this industry part-time. Which is fine. That's what it's going to be. Yeah.
But it's forcing it every day for the sake of having content to put out is, frankly, people see through that very quickly. And I think that's what's happened with a lot of ESPN's coverage. Now, it's also interesting because I think the NBA in general, historically, suffers from a lot of astroturfing of fan bases. Like there's a lot of, I've always been fascinated by the fact that the NBA has the youngest average aged fan of any of the four major sports and has for like 40 years. At some point you would think their audience would age, but it feels like their audience kind of disappears between ages 35 and 45 because people get tired of how infantile a lot of the storylines tend to be. And I feel like ESPN to some degree does the NBA a disservice because they feed into that. Because a lot of what does get talked about is either incredibly surface level stuff, or it's only focused on a very small number of stars or a very small number of teams. It doesn't take into account the breadth of the league and the way that the league has a ton of interesting players, has a ton of interesting teams, has a bunch of, there's a bunch of different methodologies by which teams go about things. And you hear about, it feels like none of that on ESPN's primary programming. And when I think about the way that they are, like, that they've tried to cover other sports, their NFL coverage has gradually grown into that as well, where it's a ton of Cowboys, it's a ton of Giants. There'll be occasional players that'll pop up, and then there'll be certain teams that they have to talk about, but they clearly don't want to. Like there's just a real resistance to covering the whole sport. And I do think that part of this issue is that if you think about the history of ESPN, when they came of age in that period we're mentioning, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, they could be the national network for everybody. And, they're going to cover the games, they're going to cover the events, things like that. I can't ever remember sitting around during the 2000 finals and saying, God, their coverage of the Pacers sucks. Like, it never even would have occurred to me to think that way. But part of that time period was there was vibrant local media, multiple outlets in in the local media that would cover these teams effectively. Now, I think New York still has that. I think LA has that to a similar degree. Chicago has it. Most of the other cities in these leagues don't have that. I mean, the Indy Star is behind a paywall. Local television is generally doing very base level stories. There's not really a local place to go for coverage of your team. So people look to ESPN, and instead they find ESPN is, basically doing the LeBron fandom thing. Like, they're covering the Lakers, Cowboys, Yankees, and maybe one or two other teams sprinkled in. Mm. And I think people get resentful of that because it's like, how can you call yourself the worldwide leader if you're only covering a small part of the league? And they don't seem at all interested in disabusing people of that notion. They are instead just like, yeah, that's what we do. We're unapologetic about it, and we're going to do it over and over and over again because we know that it's going to get whatever click numbers we need or whatever ad numbers we need to keep the network going. And there's another kind of more nefarious aspect to all of this that we'll talk about later, but that seems to be the crux of a lot of the production decisions that get made with these shows and even with the broadcast that they do for the games.
It reminds me of the whole pivot to video thing, which happens every 3 years. Everyone decides video is like the new thing instead of writing, and then it disappears, and then Facebook fakes the numbers. That was like a whole, what was that, like 5-6 years ago at this point?
That was like a solid decade ago. I hate to tell you that.
Was it a decade?
I think it was like 2014, 15, somewhere in that range. The pivot to video part, yes.
Well, no, yeah, and then there was like the whole backlash, and then it just keeps happening, and ESPN is doing this. It's a real chicken or the egg situation. I'm just like rambling at this point. But I guess that's what podcasts are for.
Yes.
And where it's like, if we give you more interesting information, eventually you'll know these teams more, and you'll be more invested when the Pacers are in the finals or when the Thunder are in the finals. And if we don't show you any of their games during the regular season, why would you care about these teams? And I just get so mad thinking about how much nothing there is on these channels.
Well, part of it is also, and I think this kind of goes back to, we have to go to ESPN's NFL coverage and look at what happened there.
Yeah.
Where ESPN tried to essentially have it both ways. They wanted to have a robust investigative journalism center that would do hard-hitting stories so that they could feel good about themselves in the newsroom. Mm-hmm. But then they also wanted to have a strong commercial relationship with the NFL. And the NFL was like, you can't do both of these things. You can't go report on Ray Rice and then expect to get our best games on Monday Night Football. Like, it's not going to work that way. And, John Skipper was like, well, no, we're going to stick to our principles. And ESPN kept getting worse and worse, and worse and worse games.
Yeah.
Then Jimmy Pitaro gets hired, and go back and read the Brian Curtis articles from The Ringer about this, the fixing of the mending of the fences. And the mending of the fences was essentially ESPN agreeing to not say nasty things about the NFL, and we'll play ball with you. Well, that arrangement clearly happens with the NBA as well. Like, there's very few actual deep critical things or investigative things that are occurring with the NBA that ESPN is originating. And when they do them, it's always couched in very specific terminologies. It all feels very sanitized because these are corporate partners that they can't afford to give up.
I mean, the Malik Beasley thing, I mean, we've talked about ESPN Bet plenty of times. And is that the more nefarious thing you were hinting towards? Okay. See, I'm following along.
Yeah. So the ESPN Bet thing, I think, is fascinating because what you have to keep in mind is ESPN got rich, really rich, for years, decades, because they had, unlike most of their partners or most of the other places in media, they had two completely separate revenue streams. They had an advertising revenue stream, which was very lucrative, and then they had the subscriber revenue stream because all of the people that had basic cable were paying essentially, by the late aughts, early 2010s, everybody was paying $7 to $9 per month to ESPN, even if you didn't watch it at all, because it was just bundled with basic cable.
And it had to be there. Like, no one was gonna. So many people would have left if ESPN wasn't part of the deal. And
that worked until people started cutting the cord about 2014. Mm-hmm. Well, we're 11 years into that, and I think we've lost like 40 or 50,000 cable subscribers, and that revenue is just not there at the same level anymore, and it's going to continue to go down. So ESPN, because they have to keep going out and buying live game rights, and they have to keep bidding on things, had to make a decision about how they were going to generate that extra revenue to try to make up the revenue that they were no longer making. Because keep in mind, they were like a profit center for Disney, who has had its own issues from a budgetary perspective, as I think those of you who follow their stock prices are aware of. Mm-hmm. And what ends up happening is they buy back a sports book that was in partnership with Barstool, which I think is hilarious. And they rebranded ESPN Bet. And they've built so much of their future earnings potential around ESPN Bet. But what that requires is being on really friendly terms with as many sports leagues as possible, because you have to have access to the data. You have to have access to, doing all of these special related items. You have to be able to build content out. You've got people making, and I mean, ESPN's not alone in this. And I want to make that clear. Sure. That, they're not the only ones who have their talent giving their best wagers for the night. But the difference is they're the rights holders, and they are supposed to be the worldwide leader in sports. And what they've done is essentially back themselves into a financial corner where that's got to work, because they don't really have a plan B, which means they can't really be that critical of the sports that they cover. They can't risk doing a lot of in-depth analysis, because they really need to be driving people to the ESPN Bet platform to make their wagers and continue to bring in that percentage of money that they're getting off of those. That's the game right now. It's a very different type of game than ESPN's ever had to be involved in before, and I don't think they've figured out really how to do it effectively.
Do you use ESPN Bet?
No.
You'll gamble here and there, right?
Yeah, I actually bet. I've used several of the platforms. I'm not interested in ESPN Bet because I don't gamble that much. First of all,
I'm the same way. Where I have a DraftKings app. I'll put $5 every so often when my friends Ben or Jake tell me to, or Taylor. But
I've gotten to the point where I'll use the Caesars app because I get points towards rooms in Vegas at this point.
But is it working? This is a broad question, and for ESPN, higher ups, not really you. But is the ESPN? Do people use ESPN Bet? Is it worth the investment that they've made in? And
I mean, there was a piece in Front Office Sports back in February, and I haven't done a huge amount of in-depth research, but Penn Entertainment, which owns the book itself, had a fourth quarter loss of $109 million, which some of you may have seen. They missed analyst forecasts, and I think what I saw was in New York, Illinois, and New Jersey, which are the top three states for sports wagering, ESPN Bet has 1% to 2% of the market in terms of revenue.
Yeah,
which is the target was 20% of the market by 2027. They got a long way to go. And I got to be honest, I don't ask my friends what they're wagering on, but I don't hear a lot of people saying you need to get on ESPN Bet, because it's kind of like it's like when weed got legalized in certain places. People would go drive to the dispensary, they would buy things. I don't know a ton of people who are like, hey, you got to try this type of gummy out, or like, it's a personal thing. And I think for a lot of people, gambling apps, I've told people, like, the Caesars app is actually really good. You should try that. I like it better than, like the BetMGM app or the DraftKings app.
But you don't care. Like,
I don't care. And I'm not, I see the ads. I've got Aaron Dolan, giving picks on my screen. It's not making me download the ESPN Bet app. So if the gambit here is we're going to take over a fifth of the marketplace in a 4-year span of time, I don't know what the hell they thought they were going to do with that, but I don't see it. I don't see it resonating at this point.
Yeah. I mean, I run a gambling podcast. I'm not hosting, but I'm on it. They've never once, we don't have any deals with FanDuel or DraftKings or Caesars or any of these other sports books. They've never once mentioned ESPN Bet. I bet you look at every transcript of the 1,000 or so episodes we've had, and not once has ESPN Bet been mentioned. And I know that's a very specific example, but it's every podcast I listen to. I mean, obviously they have deals with FanDuel, DraftKings, whatever, and ESPN obviously will promote ESPN Bet because they have to at this point. But any other podcast outside of ESPN is not referencing ESPN Bet, at least that I've heard of. Yeah. And at that point, you're so ingrained in what you have. And ESPN, like, I'm sure each of these gambling sites have different like perks and different reasons to get on. But at a certain point, you have enough apps. I mean, we've talked about apps in general, and that was like a whole Bill Simmons Grantland thing. But there's a finite amount of space where you can be betting. And it doesn't really make sense that someone would go over to a different one, especially when they're so locked in on one.
Right. Well, it's like if you've already deposited money in one or two, why get another one? Like, there's no compelling reason to. And so I think it's one of those things where, Disney hemmed and hawed over what they were doing. And part of the problem, it's ironic because, like, if you go back to the history of Deadspin, like Nick Denton wanted them to start like a sports gambling site. It's 2005 or whatever it was, which no one was talking about sports gambling that wasn't in jail at that point.
Well, ESPN hated sports gambling. They weren't allowed to mention it. None of the broadcasters. Simmons had a whole back and forth with them in Page 2.
But the guy who ran ESPN.com left ESPN to go form a site that covered gambling in 2017. Mm-hmm. That was a big move, but that, like, the ship had sailed by that point. They took so long to get to the point where they hey, we got to make this our central thing, that it was too late, I think. Now, maybe they'll make big strides here. Who knows? I'm just not seeing it happen. But I think as a factor of the coverage, it hurts. I don't know if it hurts necessarily in terms of the NBA coverage, what they're talking about, because it's not necessarily directly affecting the hot take-ishness of what's happening on the shows, nor is it necessarily affecting the content of the broadcast per se. But I do think it ties back to this idea that they're kind of caught between a bunch of different worlds, but they can't afford to piss the NBA off. They can't afford to piss the NFL off. So it ends up turning the volume down on what might be insightful things, and it ends up causing them to bring people in whose primary stock in trade is just spouting off things that can go on the internet later, even if they're not particularly interesting. And I guess that's the thing. It's like the utility of Stephen A. Smith yelling into a camera feels like it has a shelf life. And it did. In fact, as people have often forgotten, like, ESPN fired Stephen A. Smith once before, and he spent 3 years in the wilderness, and then they brought him back. Do you remember this?
No, I don't remember this.
Back in, he was he was big in 2000, 04 to 09 or 05 to 09. He had this meteoric rise. And then there was a contract dispute in 2009. So did they technically fire him? I guess not.
They just didn't renew it.
He was off the air for 2 years. And then they brought him back in 2011.
I've blocked this all out of my memory. That was probably the best 2 years of my life. I don't remember any of it. I mean, but it's not. I don't think it's just social media that's exhausted of it. I'm just from personal experience. It's my dad. It's my mom. Like, it's people just next to the TV who just hear him, Skip Bayless, whoever the guy is. They just start yelling. And at a certain point, it's like, I don't need to watch this anymore. I mean, it's the same thing with Fox News, the same thing with CNN. I mean, they're all the same at this point. But
here's the issue.
There's nothing there.
Clearly, people do watch, at least in some numbers.
Yeah.
Because that wouldn't be a method that gets used across all of television. But I do think that we've gotten to a point. These things are generational to some degree. And I do think we've gotten to a point where the number of people who are willing to watch that consistently and have that be the primary thing that they're looking at gets less and less. Now, obviously, a lot of it these days is going to be geared towards a social media audience. But the problem with the social media audience is that it's not a good sports audience from a fandom perspective. And what I mean by that is what works on TikTok or what works on Instagram Reels is not really synonymous with what works in terms of building fandom. And I think for the NBA in particular, fandom of the NBA is largely centered around players, but it also can be centered around teams. And I think a lot of times the team aspect has been left behind, perhaps to the detriment of the league. And that is hard to capture if you're focusing mostly on people saying outrageous things to try to get attention. And so you're dealing with a lot of shallow fan observation, not a lot of depth being built, not a lot of interest in the league outside of spectacular moments. And while the league definitely has spectacular moments, it's also got strategy and really interesting things that happen throughout. NFL's the same way. But ESPN's always been drawn to the highlight, and I think that DNA is hard to shake. So whether it's a highlight of somebody yelling or a highlight of a dunk, it's eye candy, but it doesn't really translate into the kind of in-depth coverage that everybody salivates over when it comes to, say, inside the NBA. Those are two very different things. And I don't know that ESPN's ever done the in-depth thing well, at least in the last 20 years. And I don't know where they get back to that, but I do think that even Gen Z is going to be looking for something more meaningful in terms of their fandom. And right now, I don't know that they're getting that with a lot of these sports if they're going to ESPN for the basis of it, because so much of what the coverage ends up focusing on is not that. I mean, and the exceptions stick out. We mentioned Scott Van Pelt. College Game Day, for the most part, does a good job of feeling like they care about college football.
Definitely.
They'll talk about it in depth. They'll showcase things visually. And it's weird to contrast that with their college basketball coverage, which is the exact opposite, where it's like the wrong people on air talking about the wrong things and doing so in a way that just feels very surface level to anybody who actually follows the sport closely. And it's just like there are certain things that ESPN does do well, but even those things you worry they're going to ruin because of what else they've ruined across the network.
Yeah, I mean, again, I want to get back to Gen Z for a second there, but ESPN was the dream when I was growing up. The place I wanted to work was ESPN the magazine, which feels like a lifetime ago at this point. I wanted to work at Grantland. I wanted to work for Page 2, that type of ESPN off-kilter, but still sports-obsessed people. I guess that's how I would describe it. And now, do people want to work for ESPN? I mean, this is part of the Gen Z thing. I'm sure they do because it's a big name and because it's one of the few places left at a certain point.
Well, yeah.
And they're laying off. Is that something that they're striving for? When you work with your students who are all Gen Z at this point, unless there's one guy just still hanging around. I was going to name names, but
never graduate, Greg.
Man, it feels so. I remember we did the interview, the end of the end of senior year interview, where you asked what are your favorite restaurants? What did you learn in college? And that feels like 5 days ago.
Yeah.
And it's like that was 8 years ago at this
8
point.
years ago. Yeah, time flies. It really does.
But like, what is Gen Z? What are your students think? Do they watch these things? Do they care about these things?
It's weird because one of the things I'll talk about a lot with our faculty members that teach in sports media is they don't watch a ton of it, or they don't pay close enough attention to it to really like. This is not a criticism of Gen Z. It's more it's not a criticism of anything. It's just the evolving nature of media. I feel like millennials, right up to the end of the millennial generation, there were so few venues to get highlights, news, information. Everybody devoured all the content. You watched all the broadcasts. You watched SportsCenter. You read
I watched
everything.
a full hour of SportsCenter, and then I would be like, oh, I haven't seen these highlights in an hour. I'll watch another 20 minutes or whatever. And you end up watching the same stuff.
And that's just not how people consume media in that generation now. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just different. And so it's what people consume tend to be, there are some shows that they'll consume, but it's not like people would be like, no, I wouldn't work at ESPN, but I don't think it's the end all be all.
And I'd work at ESPN,
Sure.
like just putting it out there if anyone's listening.
Yeah. No, it's clearly if they've listened this far.
Yeah, it may not work.
You're at the top of their list of people they want to hire.
Maybe Fox Sports 1 is going to hire me or something,
But I think that it's no longer the primary place that people want to work to. Mm-hmm. It's not like I guess like the New York Times is still like this for people that want to work in news. I don't know.
That's another podcast too. But no, I've applied for jobs in the past in New York Times. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening there, but they do good work. And the same can be said about ESPN. Like, I know I've been trashing them and you've been critical, very smartly critical, because you have a future. Wow. But the New York Times and ESPN, like, there's a reason they're institutions. Like, they matter. They're big, and people read them and watch them and listen to them for all sorts of things. I mean, the Daily's still good.
Right.
The New York Times art critics are still good. There's specific things, and ESPN's the same way. We're naming people, and they matter. So I can see like people or students looking and being like, I want to be this person, or I want to be, someone on one of these shows. I want to work on College Game Day, as opposed to I want to work at ESPN, which has more of a negative connotation than it used to, at least.
Yep. I think ultimately it really is almost dependent. But part of the problem is, frankly, for most young aspiring sports broadcasters, they look at ESPN. I don't think they can see themselves there, because who's on the air? It's mostly ex-athletes, or it's Stephen A. Smith. And this is a criticism I have of a lot of sports media, which at some point along the way, TV network executives got obsessed with the idea of, we have to have a former player here. We have to have another former player here. And it doesn't work in a lot of ways. And there are certain former players that are really good on air. You mentioned Chris Collinsworth is really good on air. I think Troy Aikman is really good on air.
I mean, Charles Barkley inside the NBA.
Well, yeah. I mean, there are people that are ex-athletes that are really good on air.
But that's the exception more than the rule.
And the problem is it's a revolving door of people who are on air. I mentioned early on in the podcast, like, the dream job unintentionally charting the terrible decision-making of ESPN. The first year of Dream Job was charming. Bunch of kids coming out of college, couple of older people who really wanted to work in sports. And you had this whole judging thing, and Mike Hall ends up winning it at the end, and he's had a long career. Like, he works for Big Ten Network, he worked for ESPN for a while. Mm-hmm. Year two, they decided to do a whole show around picking the next NBA analyst who was a former player, and no one cared. And it was a terrible sequence. But that's, no one gets invested in these people because they're all kind of cookie cutter. Or if they have personalities, they're generally personalities that don't resonate on air. And this is the Kendrick Perkins problem. Like,
it's the Tom Brady problem. Yeah. It's all, and I'm already dreading the Draymond Green problem, which we know is coming.
But at least I will say, I'll give Draymond credit for this. At least Draymond says things and has opinions that are like predicated in the game that matter from a strategic perspective. I don't always agree with what he says, but his podcast is interesting, And when he was on Inside the NBA this year, I was actually legitimately impressed with the way he broke down, as opposed to Kendrick Perkins, who says like the most basic things over and over again,
and not even entertainingly. Like
right.
that's the other that's what drives me insane. Is like it's one thing with Stephen A. going on these long tirades and rants, and there's a part of me, like the caveman part, that's like, that's fun, like that's cool, like you can see why he's worth the money. I mean, no one's worth the money he is, but why he would be paid money to talk about sports. Kendrick Perkins, he's mumbling. I mean, that 2008 Celtics run, no one's ever like coasted off anything more than that team.
It's like when Trent Dilfer was one of their primary commentators, or Sean Salisbury, back like people get on the air, and this, the way this happens, you get a TV exec who decides they're going to champion a particular athlete, and then they'll champion them until the point where they've outlived their usefulness, and then they're just gone. Like, when was the last time you saw? Is Trent Dilfer still doing media?
I feel like he pops up on a Russillo podcast or something every so often, which is, I mean, I love Russillo, but that's not where you want to be if you're trying to make it.
That's doing a favor to somebody.
Yeah. That's him promoting it. Yeah.
But my point being, like, we're picking on Kendrick Perkins right now, and rightfully so. But like there's this revolving door on ESPN, and Fox is not innocent of this either.
It's all yeah.
Like, after a while, the utility of having a former player disappears when they're not really offering anything worthwhile, and the audience notices that. And the audience, like the idea that we can throw anybody out there in front of the audience and they'll listen to them talk about sports. I always have this complaint with analysts on game broadcasts. Like, it's like, well, we have to have a former player to give insight into the game. No one can name the former player that's doing the game. Like, did anybody know that Solomon Wilcots played in the NFL?
It could have just been like, oh, he went to Northwestern, you know?
Yeah. So that's this infects a lot of what ESPN does as well, in that I guess within the thought process is, oh, well, their expertise carries the day. And then it doesn't actually carry the day because there's not a lot being contributed. There's not a lot unique. And then that person's gone and they bring another person in after a couple of years, and then they don't contribute either. And it's just this revolving door, and it makes it hard to take anything seriously.
And it doesn't seem like they're trying to build anyone. Like, it doesn't seem like.
Well, no, it's less that they've poured a ton. They pour a ton.
I'm saying build non-athletes. Like, they're not investing this money or this time into people that need to figure it out on air, and because they just don't have as many spots open too. I mean, they're giving all this money to ESPN Bet, to the different teams, to the different leagues, and there's just less opportunity and less people available.
Yeah. So, you go through from a content perspective. You had a question about like Around the Horn getting canceled.
I realize I haven't asked you a single question I have on this list.
This is what happens when you podcast with me. It ends up being 2 hours and 9 questions don't get asked. But
I have but should we get into Around the Horn for a second?
Yeah, let's talk. I mean, the
PTI and the whole what's happening.
Well, keep in mind both of those shows were 20 plus years old, and that's a long time in television. MASH only lasted 12 years in television. I mean, I think the longest running show in television history was it Gunsmoke or Bonanza? Or
Simpsons is still going at this point.
That's fair. The longest non-animated show.
No, I know what you're saying. Yeah,
but it's a long time, and we tend to forget that a television show on ESPN is still a television show. But I do think that the concern there was less about talent cultivation and more about the idea that it was hard to clip for social, and it probably wasn't resonating very much with that same Gen Z audience that you and I talked about a few minutes ago, who's not really conditioned to sit there and listen to a rotating cast of writers or non-national broadcasters talk through things. Now that's one of Courtney Cronin, who's one of our alums and one of my really good friends, had a great time on that show, did a wonderful job. It's not a criticism of the individual people. I think it's a criticism of the thought process of, well, how does this fit into what we're trying to do as a network? And if you look, and again, this goes back to the ESPN Bet thing. It goes back to playing nice with networks. The more rough edges in what's being offered out there, the more likely it is that someone's going to say something that's going to upset somebody somewhere. Why take the risk, especially if the ratings aren't that overwhelming?
Yeah. And
then, it was hard enough. Like, it was interesting when ESPN and whatever it was, 03, when they added Around the Horn, or maybe it was 02, they blocked out that whole 5 o'clock hour, Around the Horn at 5, PTI at 5:30, Sports Center at 6, leading into whatever the game of the evening was, college basketball or baseball or whatever. People don't watch TV like that anymore.
No.
They're not going to sit down. First of all, they're going to sit down and watch television. But if they did, they're not probably going to sit down and just throw ESPN on and say, I'm going to have this on until 10 or 11.
And the people watching Around the Horn, I'm sure a good amount were just listening to the podcast the next day or that night, or just watching a clip. I mean, what you're saying. I mean, my other question is PTI even still on in 2 or 3 years?
Probably not. I mean, those guys,
like their sons. I mean, those guys they've been around for a while.
Those guys are old. I mean, that's the thing is when you think about Tony Korn. How old is Tony Kornheiser? Take a guess.
Mid-70s?
76. Yes.
I mean, we've talked about this. That's the first podcast I got into.
Yeah.
Was the Tony Kornheiser show.
Oh, I used to listen to the radio show. Like, Andy Poland, I think, was his engineer or something, or his producer. But no, like, Wilbon's 10 years younger, but he's still 66. And there's nothing, I mean, both of those shows, if they were going to continue, would have been better as podcasts or as streaming shows rather than necessarily being on linear, in as much as I'm not sure how important linear is in the big scheme of things. Now, I am surprised that they didn't just say, hey, we're going to move Around the Horn off the air, but we're going to move it on to purely direct to consumer. They haven't done that. And so it does make me question, like, was there a content reason why they decided that they weren't going to go that direction? I don't know. That's a really fascinating point. But I do think, like, as the idea that would cultivate people that could be on air for them, I don't think that's important to them, going back to what you said, because, I remember talking with somebody about 10 years ago, and they were like, they either want writers and people with that background who are reporters who have sources, or they want former players and entertainment types of people. And they don't really need the writers now. Like, that's not really what the game is at this point. So what's the purpose in giving Harry Lyles or whoever a venue, or Israel Gutierrez, if we don't really want them on air, because we're not using them on SportsCenter or anything else, and we're not really emphasizing our writing product in the first place? It just kind of all loses its utility at that point.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about direct-to-consumer. I mean, that's a big thing, obviously, as well. But should we talk about the website for a second?
We can, yeah.
I mean, maybe there's not much to talk about. I mean, there's not much happening on there at this point. I mean, that was,
again,
so critical for so long.
One of the, for those of us who follow certain sports where we want to get info, and look, ESPN still employs a lot of good writers. Mm-hmm. But so, like, one of my favorites is Bill Connolly, who, covers college football, does S&P Plus. They make a big deal about bringing him over from SB Nation. And it's very, very hard to find Bill Connolly's stuff on ESPN.
It's hard to find anything on ESPN. Like, you can find the scores. Yep. You can find a bunch of video clips of Stephen A. and whoever else yelling. But if you want to find an article from anyone, especially if you want to find an old article, I mean, you're better off Googling or using the Wayback Machine or whatever else, or just hoping that one of them tweets it out. Yeah. I mean, that's part of the thing, is that I find stories a lot of times now through Twitter, I was going to say Facebook, but I don't use Facebook anymore, through Reddit, through Instagram. Like, no one's going to a website and just scrolling through anymore the way that they were 10, 15 years ago. Yeah. But you just think that there's like a certain level of like care where it's like the website, I mean, it's everything, where it's just not usable at a lot of times.
Well, but I think you hit the nail on the head. If people aren't using it that much, then what's the point? Yeah. What's the point? And this is, again, I think, where we're all trying to keep up at various age levels with how digital media is transitioning. And look, what have we done for the last hour and 5 minutes? Are people still watching? Maybe. Ben Wittenstein, shout out if you're still watching. I guarantee he's not. He won't notice this at
There's
all.
no way.
No way. He's turned this off. I'm guessing the 26th minute, maybe, and that might have been if he passed out.
That's still. I mean, it's like 7:30 in Chicago right now. Well, I guess this isn't live.
We're not.
So who cares?
No, that's my point. Is that we're doing this on YouTube. Mm-hmm. I'm going to also upload it to Spotify.
Sure.
This is the venue through which a lot of, not this show in particular, although it should be.
This show. But this and Joe Rogan. These are the top two.
God. Okay, I'll take that. That's fine. Yeah. This is the show this is the venue through which people are gaining a lot of their information on sports. And I just look at it like this. I complain about ESPN because I care about it as an institution. I guess the same way that, print obsessive people felt or feel perhaps about the New York Times, the Washington Post. Maybe there's others that fall into that category. But realistically speaking, if people aren't going to ESPN as the place of record for coverage of sports, we probably should stop expecting them to act that way, because they're not going to. And instead, they're going to media that is essentially a level down in terms of national spread, because they want to focus on niche things that are interesting to them. Sometimes that's your team. You can complain all about the Pacers not having coverage on ESPN, and I think that that's legitimate when you're trying to do a national television broadcast. That's the one thing where it crosses over. Or you can, the Thunder have similar complaints. There was not a lot of coverage of the Thunder, despite it being the best team in the NBA.
I mean, they have a better case, honestly, to be upset than the Pacers, the Pacers were good all season, but the Thunder were like...
Yeah, they were the best team in the league. They were a historically
good 68 wins, and they're still the Lakers and, the Celtics and whoever else.
So that's the case for there needs to be better coverage on the website, on the broadcast properties, is that if you are the primary partner of the league, because where else is the league media coming from? Well, but that's where it becomes regional or local. Yeah. And that's where I've kind of made peace with the idea that I'll turn on ESPN when they have the games, but they don't even have all the games anymore. They in most of these sports.
Well, no one has the games
everybody's got the games.
Everyone. No one has the games. Everyone has the games.
Right. But I don't get sore about ESPN not talking about my team unless it's directly affecting my team's ability to do something. So like the way Indiana football got covered by ESPN during the whole college football playoff thing really pissed me off and pissed a lot of IU fans off. But that's because the selection, the committee stuff was all ESPN.
It almost screwed them over. Yeah.
Right. And you're just kind of like, why is this the discourse? And why are you letting your partnership with the SEC, again, going back to the corporate partnership thing, why are you letting that affect the way that you're covering things? And I think that ultimately, for a lot of fans across the country, the idea that ESPN represents all of them is gone. And ESPN does nothing to combat that, because what they seem to be most interested in is, can we get enough people watching this to justify charging advertisers, and can we drive people to ESPN Bet? Those seem to be the primary considerations. Yeah. And people get mad about that. To a degree, they should get mad about political coverage for the exact same reason, and they don't get nearly as mad about that. That's really what they should be more mad about.
Yeah.
But instead, we proxy it with ESPN because, again, ESPN once came from a place that felt like legitimate fandom and legitimate joy, and like the whole This Is SportsCenter commercial campaign that ran 20 years and was incredible. And the way that they would cover different things, it felt like these folks are on our side. And then progressively, they felt less and less like they're on our side.
Yeah, I mean, it was truly I was looking through old photos recently because my parents were moving, and there was a picture of me in 2006, 2007 in front of the Hollywood sign, and I'm wearing an ESPN shirt, and it says on-air talent, and I was like 11, 12 years old, and it's like I was obsessed with, I wanted ESPN shirts. We went to ESPN Zone. I remember the ESPN phone and thinking that was cool, even though it was like the least cool thing that's ever existed.
I subscribed to ESPN the magazine. I'm guessing you're saying next.
Oh, I was obsessed with ESPN the magazine. That was where I wanted to work. That was it. But I mean, to defend ESPN, which, after an hour and 15 minutes, it's time to start defending them. They did try. Like, they tried. I mean, there was the Bomani Jones, Pablo Torre show that lasted a few months. There was the Jamel Hill Sports Center. I feel like there was an attempt to make things. They had the Katie Nolan streaming show.
But I feel like the four personalities you just highlighted all have one common problem, which is actually it's two problems, I would say. One, that's a case of ESPN severely overestimating mass market appeal of all of those people.
Yeah.
Again, the bigger issue, and it's no issue with those individuals, it's more a case study in not grasping what your audience is looking for.
Yeah.
People didn't want to center around personalities. They wanted to center around the sport writ large. They wanted the moments around the sport. They wanted the stories of the coaches and the athletes. They wanted to hear people who were having legitimate, interesting conversations about the sport, because that was their source of information about the sport, and it gave them the opinions that they should think of, but it wasn't forced on them. It's like if you go back and watch Baseball Tonight, it was a sober, discussion-based show with some highlights and some cool things. You had a really level-headed host in Carl Ravitch, and you could kind of go down the list of the different shows that they would have, and most of them fit that paradigm. But centering around that group of four, like Bomani Jones, who I think is incredibly intelligent, really fascinating individual in media, but that is one of the most niche people.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I feel like they tried to put the podcast on TV.
Yeah.
And that's not where the audience is. And
Right.
maybe you're right. Maybe I've just been upset, and it's just not we're not putting that genie back in the bottle. It's like,
well, I don't know what is television at this point. I mean, look at what Warner Brothers and Turner just did. They're
my boss. Yeah.
Right. Well, they just took the non-television parts, put it in a different company, and said, we think that's the winner. That was essentially the thought process. And you read everything now about all these zombie cable channels that are just running reruns of Law and Order SVU or, Naked and Afraid or whatever they're running.
And they're better than the new shows. A lot of time, people would rather watch old MASH at this point or old,
Right.
Frasier than anything else that's new.
Right. But what that means is ultimately, if ESPN, for all the other products that they have had and have currently, at the core, they are a they're a cable station that focuses on sports. Now in 2025, in an era where cable channels aren't that important, you don't need them to watch things, and you've got 2-3 generations. It's never been about the method of transmission as much as the idea that, these people are just going to be on newspaper and only read newspapers. Mark Cuban said this in 2006 or something like that when he was justifying not credentialing blogs to come cover the team. But even older audiences, and as the boomers continue to age and as Gen X starts to age into that, they move with the technology. They take a while to follow along behind it. And the problem is ESPN hasn't. And this is where ESPN is still, because of who they are, trying to run a cable channel in an era where you can't really run a cable channel. And I would present for evidence, look what's happening to CNN right now. CNN up still, right now, unless he got fired recently, they're still, how much are they paying Anderson Cooper?
I mean, yeah, who's watching the show? Yeah.
Why are you paying Anderson Cooper that amount of money?
There's no reason.
There's no justification for it other than that's what we did 10 years ago.
It's the legacy media. I mean,
Right.
It's the Condé Nast, the whole thing. Yeah.
Now, where I think you could make an argument is if we're going to, we spent a bunch of time complaining about the linear network.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're going to be realistic about where ESPN goes from here, you almost have to tell them, stop focusing on the linear network, which is easier said than done because it's the easy layup in terms of ad revenue. That's where they get a lot of their money. You can't just say we're not going to have this, but it also can't be the centerpiece of what you're doing from a content perspective. I guess my concern with ESPN sometimes is that when I look at the shows that they've decided to air, I look at a lot of the Meadowlark stuff that they were picking up. I look at a lot of the Omaha production stuff, and I like it in pieces. But there's very little where I watch it and I'm like, I got to watch that every day. Even like, I know the Pablo Torre thing, they keep trying to elbow their way into the conversation nationally. But it feels forced in a lot of ways, in a way that it shouldn't. If you compare that to actually like big successful podcasts, and I would throw Pat McAfee into this mix, and I know you wanted to talk about him a little bit. It feels like ESPN's trying to astroturf their way into something that other people are doing naturally.
Yeah.
Because they're still handcuffed to all these corporate procedures that they've done for years that are still focused on what they're doing on linear, and linear just doesn't work anymore. And it's like, until they can break free of those shackles, I don't know that they're able to actually move in to be truly competitive. Like, I actually would say at this point, I think Fox is better positioned than ESPN to do this, because Fox was never so entirely married to like a singular entity as a national sports channel.
So there's a lot there. What's your ideal, like, what do you want from ESPN? Like, I know we've talked about them focusing on more different things in terms of like the bigger broadcast, the national broadcast, but like, if you could pick something that you think would actually work, what would you ask for, or what would you try to produce?
Well, this is where I think if ESPN is going to be successful, like, this is where I don't know that they can do everything that they've tried to do. Like, they can't. I think their biggest mistake right now is trying to make back the money that they've lost through cable subscriptions falling by jumping into the wagering market, because they're not going to be able to compete at a high enough level to generate the revenue to make up for it.
No.
So they got to figure out other things. And I think that they are in a similar boat now with Fox and with NBC and I guess CBS. Like, that's really your big four in terms of the players in this, since Turner's taken themselves out of the equation to some degree.
Yeah.
The weird thing about all of this is the sports that all these areas are covering are entirely reliant on the money that they're making off of the television contracts.
Yep.
So
that's where the salaries are coming from. That's where everything's coming from. Yeah.
So, it's funny with this NBA thing, with all these owners selling teams lately. And everybody's like, ooh, is something on the horizon? And I think it's easy to say, well, no, the league's just in great shape and they could go international, and they could. But the flip side is, well, maybe there is something wrong. And I could see like a Mark Cuban or a Bus family saying to themselves, well, this might be as good as it ever gets.
Yeah.
In terms of money, because media money is entirely dependent on centralized audience. And that's where all of this money from ESPN came from. It's where the Fox money came from. It's where CBS has all this money. And there's only so many sports that you can spread that around on. And at some point, unless you have another way of bringing that money in, you're going to run into some brick walls. And I will say that I think we're at a point now with, say, the NBA, and I think actually Major League Baseball may be the one that is the big next one to fall, because of, they were the ones that really hit hardest by Diamond Sports Group and all of these regionals essentially not having a workable business model. So do they start going direct to consumer? If Major League Baseball can go direct to consumer and say, hey, you know what? We know that you hate our streaming stuff, and we know you hate not being able to watch your teams. What about everybody pays $150 a year and you get all of the games?
Yeah.
You're going to make more direct money, and then you can sell ads. And
just
you can
league pass for everything, you're saying.
League pass for everything. And then you can still have Apple or whoever doing specialty games, because people have that subscription as well. Yeah. And they'll pay for that. So I do wonder with ESPN, they just ponied up a huge amount of money for the NBA. They spent a decent amount of money on the NHL. They've got a couple of other things. They've let some things go. But what I would like to see them do is decide, like, are we a live sports carrier that covers sports? Are we an opinion machine that's trying to generate like ad revenue and audience that way? What are we doing? What I really want them to do more than anything else is pick a lane and figure out what that lane looks like,
instead of trying to straddle everything all at once.
And And I think that their problem is ultimately they are an item on the ledger sheet for Disney in a way that Fox Sports is not for News Corp, in a way that NBC is not for Comcast or whatever, in a way that CBS is not. I mean, well, that's a separate story, I guess. At this point, they might end up being that.
Yeah.
But ESPN has some very specific problems in that I think people don't realize how critical the revenue from ESPN was to Disney specifically, given how low margin the theme park business is and how Disney's other big revenue generator was what, Greg?
Disney's?
The movie industry.
Oh, the movie. Yeah.
Which last time
great.
was not in great shape, I mean.
I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot there. And as evidenced by how Elio did, Pixar is really scraping the barrel. Like they all are. I mean,
they've made the same movie for 20 years.
Yeah, at a certain point, toys can talk. Is not going to bring more people into. Like,
wow, I've seen that animation 8,000 times. Yeah, no,
it's all about Bluey now. Apparently, that's what I've heard. I mean, I don't have any kids, so I'm not really sure.
I love Bluey. Bluey's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, how old are your kids now? They're in college. I mean, where are they at? They're like 37.
I have an almost 10-year-old and a 7-year-old.
What are they? Do they care about Disney stuff?
You know what my kids do? They stream Netflix and they play video games. They're co-oping on Stardew Valley right now, and they're so it's amazing and it's informative because they're both Gen Alpha, obviously, and they have iPads. I know people say you're a horrible parent. You let your kids have screens. My response is, but they watch like tween shows.
Okay.
In a screen, like a picture in picture, while playing games. It's the weirdest thing.
No, I have friends that do that now. Millennials are doing that. I mean.
So but they're not really watching cartoons anymore. Like they did for a long time. We watched Bluey. We would watch, what the other ones? Bubble Guppies was a big one in the household.
Haven't watched that one.
A lot of Muppet Babies, like the new version of Muppet Babies, who has a really annoying new character compared to the old one. I
mean, there's a reason. I mean, this is why Disney is doing these live action things because they're appealing to the people that watch these things in theaters or cared about them.
I mean, is Disney still around without Star Wars at this point?
Marvel, I guess.
Maybe. Right. But that's the thing. It's the big blockbuster. And it's all these already prepackaged things. And this is, I think, the problem to some degree. It actually kind of explains NBA coverage on ESPN.
Yeah.
Who wants new plot lines when we can run the same sequel 9 times?
LeBron's going to retire at some point. Like, maybe he won't. Maybe he won't. Actually,
it's a generational thing because 25 years ago we were dealing with this with Jordan, right?
Yeah.
And there was like that 5-year walk in the wilderness where it's like, who's gonna take because like it was Kobe until the Colorado thing, and
then it was kind of Kobe again.
Right. If somehow that all got forgotten,
they just powered through.
But to go back to your question about what do I want from ESPN, I don't see. At some point, I think the sports partners are like, what is exactly that we're getting from ESPN? Like, what's the purpose of this partnership? Because like historically, sports media has been a symbiotic relationship where sports needed media to promote the games, promote the players, promote the coaches. Media needed sports to bring in audience. Everybody was happy. But that was in an era when sports teams couldn't make their own media. And now they can, oftentimes at higher quality than what media itself is creating on behalf of sports.
I mean, there's more jobs hiring. Yeah. Like there's more, the NBA is hiring more people than,
When you asked me earlier, what do my students want to do? Like a lot of the people who 10 years ago would have said, I want to be a Sports Center anchor. They're now like, I want to work for a team. I want to be a reporter for a team. And I get that because that seems to be where the stability is at this point for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, every media conglomeration is going to lay you off at some point, like I've made it 6 years and everyone, I mean, honestly, I'm applauding myself every day. I don't know how I'm doing it. I mean, everyone else has gone to law school, or they're just finding jobs here and there, and they're making it work. Like
your generation has been really interesting to watch, and it's like, I mean, my generation kind of went through this too, because like I was right at the end of the pre-digital era.
Yeah.
And most of the people that I went to school with are no longer in it and haven't been for a while. A few hung on and have had really successful careers, but a bunch of people didn't. And I think your generation kind of is in a different transition point. And, it's tough because there is money, but all the money is hoarded at the very top. And increasingly independent media, which ESPN is certainly, just doesn't have the bandwidth to do the things they need to do. They don't have the money to throw around, and they're not going to take risks. And unfortunately, being risk averse in media, when the teams themselves can be more like risk-philic or whatever they can be more adept at handling risk and dealing with it. Mm-hmm. It puts the big media companies in a very difficult position, and it puts the people working in the industries in even worse positions, because you end up doing the same things over and over again, which gets very soul draining, and your job is constantly in jeopardy because all it takes is one person saying, well, we don't need that person anymore, and then what do you do at that point? You have to go to something else, and you're probably never coming back,
and there's 100 people ready to take your job too.
Yeah.
Like you get laid off,
there are people that will pay that will have to pay less,
and that's what they're all doing. Is why would we pay someone 150,000 when we could pay them 72,000 or whatever, and let them fend for themselves?
It's funny, you had a question in the list, like, was Simmons right about ESPN never backing podcasts? And he's right. First of all, like, name a non-show based podcast that's must listen off of ESPN.
A non-show. I mean, I don't listen to any of them. Yeah.
But right. And I mean, I listened to the Low Post when it was on.
Yep.
And that was about it. I would listen to the Simmons podcast and the Grantland-based podcast. Those were fun, and those had like some they good cultural elements to them in a lot of cases. But I'll try listening to like Windhorst's podcast. And as much as I do enjoy Windhorst reporting, that format doesn't work.
It's really like an in-between TV and podcast, where it still feels like they're trying to hit the segments,
right,
and not go on tangents,
right.
Where it's like, when I'm listening to a podcast, I don't care if it's 2 hours, if it's two guys that I like. So it's usually guys, just in general, when it's a podcast. I mean, as evidenced by what we're doing right now.
Hey.
But just going on, like,
I earlier today recorded and produced a 35-minute podcast that just had two women talking. So I'm doing my part, Greg.
That's
what are
true.
you doing?
No, I'll listen to it when it comes out. Women could do anything now. So
they could always do anything. But yes,
there you go.
But the point is, my feeling on that comment from Simmons, he's right, but maybe not in the way he intended.
Mm-hmm.
Podcasting was the big leap for a lot of sports media, in terms of like podcasts done the way that podcasts should be done, which, as you described, are free-flowing, discussion-based, tangential in a lot of ways. Those are the things that have demonstrated staying power. And it's not just sports. It's like, WTF or Rogan, any of these podcasts that have Call Her Daddy, these huge podcasts across, multiple demographics, multiple geographical areas. Mm-hmm. They generally all have a quasi-formatless approach that works really well and is adaptable to the moment. And I would argue that what you end up with happening with ESPN is that they are so handcuffed to format. Has to be this, has to be that. They've let some things shoot up, but then they were always tied to the individual. When the individual left, it was gone. Mm-hmm. And they didn't want to replicate that. They ended up going in a different direction. What always bothered me is, like, I hate overproduced podcasts.
Oh,
Like
exactly the same.
When they launched ESPN Daily, I was like, oh, this would be interesting. And I listened to like 2 episodes of it. I was like, no, not interesting at all. Not a bit, because of the way it was produced.
Yeah.
It was, and I mean, it's obviously a takeoff of the Daily, another horrifically overproduced podcast.
I mean, we had our own problems. I mean, this is a specific example with Golf Digest, where we started this local knowledge podcast. We're supposed to be these like 30-minute stories, kind of like the Daily, every week, every 2 weeks. And at the beginning, it was so produced. And at a certain point, it was like, it felt exhausting to make it and to listen to it. And now it's more of just, I mean, it's Shane Ryan, who just basically going.
My buddy Shane Ryan.
Shane.
I spent one really interesting evening with him in Chapel Hill a decade ago. So
who's the best? I mean, he's great. And he just starts talking for like 35, 40 minutes. And we'll do like a few small things here and there. We'll add some music. We'll add some clips or whatever. But for the most part, it's just him doing hardcore history or, one of those types of podcasts. And it's so much better now because it's less. It's just and also like no one listens to a podcast 40 minutes straight. I mean, I guess, I do here and there. I mean, I do, but like not everyone. And sometimes you listen for 10 minutes here.
Yeah.
But you get lost.
Yes.
If you don't do that. Like, I don't know why I'm saying that. I've listened to podcasts for like 3 hours straight. But sometimes and if you're trying to get back into like this pre-produced packaged podcast, it's almost impossible. It's like trying to get back into a TV show 2 weeks later, and you're like, I don't remember what happened there 15 minutes ago. So maybe in this elongated format, you've actually drawn out what I really want out of ESPN, which is take the suit off, like get casual again, like get casual with your formatting. I mean, this is what I worry about with Inside the NBA. And I think this was one of the questions you asked was like, is ESPN going to ruin Inside the NBA? And the answer is absolutely yes, because what has been the poison for ESPN, along the other things that we've talked about, but what has been the poison for ESPN has been trying to cram things into boxes that they don't fit into. Yeah. And if there's one thing from Inside the NBA that makes it a great show, it is that it is essentially like, it's like the Tom Snyder version of a late night talk show where it's just, we're going to sit here and talk. And it might not go anywhere, or it might be the most hilarious thing you've ever heard. It's the antithesis of like the Jimmy Fallon, Jay Leno approach. Well, did you watch, this is random, did you watch John Mulaney's talk show on Netflix? No, I haven't. He did these live hour shows for like 12 weeks straight. And it was really just like, you could tell they were just winging it. You could tell they were like, he was talking to guests, and as he's asking them questions, he's figuring it out on the fly. They're going random. Like, that's the type of thing that I enjoy more. I mean, obviously I'm a fan of Mulaney, but even Seth Meyers, who I feel like he's like, he's literally taken the suit off. Like, he had a suit on, took it off. Now he's just wearing like a regular jacket. He'll talk to a guest like James Acaster for just 8 minutes about whatever, instead of these like pre-planned segments about like them playing like fake strip poker or, whatever Jimmy Fallon's doing nowadays. I feel like there's a middle ground between podcasts, which are, 2 hours of nonsense in a good way, versus like the First Take style rapid segments about LeBron, I just thought of Tim Tebow for some reason, but that's what it was for so long. They were just talking about Tebow for every 10 minutes. Yeah. And there's got to be some way to bridge the gap. There is, but I don't think that these networks are willing to do it. And it's ironic, and I don't feel bad for the NBA. They took the money, but the fact that they've ditched Turner. I mean, Turner kind of ditched them, but they've decided to take up with NBC, who might be the only network worse than ESPN at trying to jam everything into a box. Like, when I think of shows that have gone completely off the rails but are still being done in like a worse and worse style every year, it is the Sunday Night Football show, not the broadcast. Yeah. I mean, I think Tirico, I'll never look at Tirico as a play-by-play guy, but I think he's fine. He's fine. Yeah. And I still think Collinsworth is really good as a color guy, even if he's just got a shtick that will naturally just get old over time. When you listen to anybody for 20 years, it'll get old. I don't blame him for that. But their studio show I think it still holds the record for most unnecessary regular people
on a show. And it's a great example of everything we just complained about with ESPN. It's like no one asked for Chris Sims to be an expert. No one said, I really wish I knew what Chris Sims was talking about with this game. No, like we don't need him and Rodney Harrison and Tony Dungy and I've lost track. There's like 9 other people.
No, I mean those shows are
they're just
insane.
unwatchable. They're unwatchable.
They're SNL sketches that just don't end. I mean, I guess they're just SNL sketches at this point, but they're nothing. And at a certain point, you don't. It's like we were saying with ESPN, where it's like you get these 30-second segments, and you get each person talking because everyone has to talk the same amount of time for 45 seconds. Nothing happens, and then you go to commercial, and you're like, what did we do any of that for? We could have just done 4 minutes of one guy giving one actual opinion.
And I think it's some of like part of this is an executive issue. And I think it's ESPN has the same problem that NBC does. We paid a lot. Fox is not exempt from this. We don't need 6 people on the desk.
Like we gave them the money. We spent a
lot of money on Gronk. We got to have Gronk on this show with Michael Strahan and Howie Long and Terry Bradshaw and whoever the other person is. And Kurt Manif. It's like, no, like just put 3 people on the desk and have them talk, or put 2 people on the desk and have them talk.
Throw Pat McAfee in there, Let's put him on one of those shows too.
The McAfee thing is fascinating. I did want to touch on that. Now that we're hour 3 almost. Not really. We're 96 minutes.
You're gonna cut this down into like 20 minutes, right? The
whole
thing.
I'm not. This is.
No, this is it. I'll listen to it.
People wanted summer content. They've gotten summer content. Okay.
Yeah, listen to this at the pool.
We're going to drop this probably the day or 2 before the 4th of July. You're going to go walk the dog on the 4th of July. You're going to drive around with the family a little bit. You're going to listen to this.
I'm so sorry to everyone out there.
But yeah. This is what better way to celebrate our country's independence than nearly 2 hours of this. Anyway.
I mean, it's better than whatever else America's doing.
What is your opinion of the McAfee thing? Just in general, with the ESPN aspects of them. I mean, the streaming show, look, whatever you think about the content, I think you have to tip your hat to McAfee from an organizational perspective. The popularity that show has garnered over the course of a relatively short period of time. It's kind of the other side of the podcast coin that I was mentioning earlier, where it's like the fact that format works when everything about broadcast television said that format shouldn't work is really remarkable. But anyway, go ahead.
I don't. I'm speechless. I don't know. I don't get it. I can't say I've watched a lot of it. I've tried it because it's on, and it'll be on at the gym or it'll be on like in the office, and I'll watch like 3 minutes of it, and it doesn't make any sense. I don't know if I'm missing something. He's never really made sense to me. Even when he was at Barstool, what was that, 10, 12 years? I mean, he was there for like 30 days.
I've lost track of when he was.
Barstool, Indianapolis, when that happened. But I truly don't get it at all. Like, it's a real, like.
And you're kind of the target demographic for him. Like,
I guess, but he's not Barstool. Like,
no, it's like it's essentially like it's like a white labeled Barstool,
Yeah, I mean, I listened to Part of My Take when it started. I thought it was very fun, and at a certain point, I got it. I was like, at a certain point, I can hear what was there, Hank or whatever, like them making fun of him. I can listen to PFT do his weird, like. I just like it feels so long ago at this point, and I just couldn't do it at a certain point.
Right.
And this feels like the high def version or the high res version of that, where it's the same. Honestly, it's the same thing with Le Batard's show,
right,
where it's just one guy throwing to 8 different people, except this one has Aaron Rodgers, doing vaccine talk. So that's
it's funny. Le Batard is interesting because I lived in Miami. I was a professor down there for a couple of years when he just had a show on what was it, Sports Plus 790 or whatever it was, the ticket down there, and it was funny drive time talk radio. Mm-hmm. All of the Mike Ryan was there, and Stugatz was the co-host, and they had Roy, and they had these a lot of the pieces that became what now is the Le Batard show were there. But it was segmented. And I almost feel like this is where the segmenting can help occasionally with this type of programming. I know I just complained about segmenting, but it's not. It works in certain ways. The McAfee thing, it is weird to me because
like, do you think the McAfee thing works? I mean, I guess it is working. Do you watch it? Do you ever enjoy it?
I think if no, I don't. I watch it. I don't enjoy it. I don't watch it that much because I don't enjoy it. I don't. But I also acknowledge it's not for me. So I'm not like, this sucks.
That's kind of how I feel, where it's not for me. But then
who's it for? I guess becomes the question mark.
And then the things that do pop up,
right,
when I do see it on social media, or I see someone send a clip or whatever it is, that frustrates me, because I'm like, this is going the wrong way in terms of what I want from sports coverage.
Yeah, I mean, the if you look at the demographics of the show, it's one of those. I mean, it clearly has appeal in that, 82% of the viewership is males 18 to 44, and it's got female viewers. It's not like it's exclusively male, but it's one of those situations where they're clearly they've grasped something that others could not. When they launched across ESPN in 2023, they had 242 million views in the first month, which is an insane amount of views. But I just think to some degree it's a show that, they're able to garner audience because there's a shtick, and the shtick vibes with people in the same way that Barstool does.
By shtick, do you just mean like McAfee's
personality,
like whatever he is?
Shtick, I don't mean shtick to be a bad thing.
Yeah.
But and this is, I think to some degree, it's like, it works in a way that the segmented stuff and the NBA coverage for ESPN doesn't, because it, in that environment, feels more organic in nature. Yeah. And it may not be your cup of tea, but it definitely works within the confines of what they're doing. So that's where, again, I'm like, I'm not the type of person to say this just sucks and I won't watch it. I won't watch it, but I'm not going to just say it sucks. It's just like, I know this doesn't really hit me because, I prefer a different type of discussion. I prefer a different type of approach. But I don't think you can build a network around it. And I guess that's where ESPN, and again, this kind of goes back to the astroturfing thing I was talking about earlier. They bring this show on, and, they try to change it to the point that McAfee goes nuclear on Norby Williamson and gets him fired, which is like, whoa. But should they have done that? Because, I mean, maybe they should have. But the idea was, we're going to change our approach entirely, but only in this case. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, if you're going to do that, why not blow the lid off of everything? Like, why not try a bunch of different things? And I guess that's what irritates me. They drop him in on College Game Day, and it kind of works, but it completely changes the tenor of the show. And now they've taken what was a good back and forth talk with some mildly interesting people, but it's changed the tenor of it so much that Kirk Herbstreit has literally turned himself into a national heel when it comes to college football coverage.
But Game Day is still getting views. Like, that's the thing. Like, it's
but my point is, did they need to? I don't think they needed to drop McAfee into that environment to get views. I think that College Game Day, it's like college football exists unto itself, and ESPN has tried to stake that out as their own. But I think it's a college football thing. I don't think it's a McAfee thing. Like, the college football video game comes back last year and becomes the top-selling sports video game of all time. This was a property that didn't exist for 11 years.
And now college basketball is coming back. I mean, it's obviously not the same thing, but they're just trying to...
It won't turn the same numbers, but yes.
It'll do fine. It'll do okay. Yeah.
But it's like they didn't need to go down that road, I don't think. And that's where, again, I don't know that ESPN, the fact they hit on McAfee as a success, it's almost like there's a limited amount of credit I'm willing to give you for that.
Do you think it was McAfee's idea to go on Game Day, or they threw him on there?
I don't know. I would guess it was probably a mutual thing, because, like, who wouldn't want?
I'm just curious if it was a McAfee, like, hey, I'm coming there, throw me on this show. I think I could do something with it, which he can and has done, depending on who you are. Or is it ESPN being like, we're giving this guy all this money, like we want him to be one of the faces of the network.
I have to
do everything with him.
I mean, there was that whole thing, where McAfee had considered leaving ESPN and forming his own version of Game Day. That got a lot of play in a bunch of different spots. But he, back in 2024 when he first joined, there. I have to go back and listen to the podcast. We did a podcast. I think it was the Kelsey Brothers podcast, and he was like really like excited about being a part of College Game Day, and being a part of that institution. So I'm assuming it was at the very least a mutual thing, if not more ESPN's idea, but I'm not totally sure.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah. So I don't know. I guess it all kind of comes back to a central point, and we should probably wrap up now. But
I was going to say, this is, I feel like, how we end it through the book. I always think I read that book multiple times growing up. The ESPN.
Those guys have all the fun. Yeah.
Where does this what is this chapter? I mean, what is the start of it, and like where does it end? I mean, if you knew that, you'd be $1 billion man. But where is it going?
It's interesting because the book, the way it lays out ESPN, like the first, it's funny how much of a linear upward trajectory ESPN follows from 1979 through all the early struggles, through getting the cable carriage stuff, through getting the NFL contract, through their building their relationships with the different leagues. They don't really hit a roadblock of significant proportions until the Shapiro era starts.
Yeah, there's like personal roadblocks.
Right.
Like this guy did this and had a problem, but
really
a network. Yeah.
You get to that point in the late 90s. They have this crisis of identity. And it's funny because we talked about some of the shows. PTI came out of this, Around the Horn came out of this, but they also did like ESPN Original Entertainment movies. They did the Season on the Brink, which was
what was the TV show they did that made the NFL furious? They had the Playmakers. That was it. Yeah.
That show's 22 years old. Go back and watch that at some point, folks. That's a fascinating look at an era, and you'll watch it and you're like, what's the big deal? But that was the good stuff.
Yeah.
And we forget the amount of not good stuff. It's like Tilt. I don't know if you remember Tilt, or
just the name of it.
There was another one that like they did a movie on Dale Earnhardt. They did
and 30 for 30.
30 for 30 was them coming out of that.
Yeah. It's like on the other side.
Sports Century was that era, and they were trying things, but they clearly didn't know what they wanted to be, and they started to fundamentally change the format of Sports Center and all that. Now they survived that. And I would, I'd argue that a second golden age there from like 03, 04 through about 14. I just think that when the money sources dried up, they gradually ran out of they lost the confidence that they had to be the tastemaker. And they started following trends that they didn't really understand from a programming perspective that led them down a pathway to where they were still handcuffed by the procedures that they had built up over time internally that said you have to do it this way, while trying things that didn't work in those formats and then discarding them quickly when they didn't work immediately because they needed to have successes to make up for what at the time looked like a correctable lessening of audience. And rapidly, I think they figured out, well, we actually can't do anything about this. People aren't going to just stop cutting cable because we have a new show or a new approach to things. And so I think this chapter, it's kind of like that crisis of conscience chapter from that period. This particular chapter starts with Jimmy Pitaro, though. And this idea that we are going to subjugate our editorial approach to the leagues because our partnerships with the leagues are the most important thing, both because we need access, we need the NFL to give us highlights and to be a partner, but now increasingly, we need the partnership from a wagering perspective. And when you add in that they're trying to still do things in a very linear format and that they don't really know how to promote their nonlinear stuff particularly well, I just think they're trying to do too many things in too many different venues. They can't leave behind the past, and they're largely being driven by profit motive, and that's a terrible place to be with any media entity. I don't care if it's ESPN or anybody else. As we've seen time and time again, you don't get where you need to get to, and you end up treading water at best when you go that route.
I'd read that book. I'd read that next chapter.
I'll get right on that.
Yeah, yeah. You with Jim Miller, right?
Yeah, Jimmy Miller and me. Yeah, we're what's
work
he
on that together.
Anything lately? I've lost track of him. He was on every podcast. It felt like for 5 years.
He had his own podcast too for a second. Yeah, I know him from, he used to pop up on Simmons' podcast and just break down SNL on ESPN, and that was like the entire reason he showed up. But
another institution that nobody cares about at this point.
Yeah, it's a bummer. I mean, it took 2 hours to say that, but I mean, it's just, it's not for me anymore. I guess that's where it comes down to.
I think for the vast majority of people, that really hits the nail on the head. It is just another place that has sports on. And
sometimes there's good stuff, and a lot of times there isn't, and that's just what it is. I mean,
but it really goes back to me to like a thing we talked about, which is of the 9,000 things we've covered on this show, which is that so much of the magic of ESPN was tied up in the magic of television, and television is not magical anymore. I mean, television it's a vessel for content that lives somewhere else.
What was more people watch YouTube than anything else at this point?
Yeah,
which is I mean Netflix is number 2. I mean, TV's just gonna keep dropping. Except for live sports, there's no reason to have TV anymore.
Right. I mean, you need a television because it has apps on it that you can watch. But, the YouTube TV app on my television is just one of the apps on there. It's not, the default is not, let's see what's on TV.
Yeah.
The default is, let's figure out what to watch. And then you got to go through 9 different options to get there. So anyway, well, fun times.
Do we fix it? We fixed it?
We fixed it. The check is in the mail, I think, for the consultancy. But no, fun conversation, and enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been a few hours, but I definitely got something out of this. I think
it felt cathartic from a sports fandom perspective. Even more so than diagnosing ESPN's problems. I do think there's a lot of frustration among sports fans because sports fandom had a moment there for about 25 years where it felt like there was a cool place to go that was the place to go for sports. And sports has never been bigger, but there's not really a central locus of sports fandom anywhere. But I think you could say the same thing about any aspect of culture or politics at this point. There's not a central point to go, which really to some degree illustrates some larger societal issues that we've got.
And it was cool. That was, I know we've talked around it, but it was, you wanted to have the shirt that said ESPN on it.
Yeah.
You wanted to do all these things. You wanted to, and now it would just be like, why do you have that? Did they give it to you? What's the point of this? There's so many, or you'd have a Pat McAfee shirt, which I'm probably not going to get anytime soon.
It's not high.
Which is just a black tank top, I guess.
They're right. Yeah. I mean, I'm actually shocked he doesn't have an Amazon storefront just to sell those. I never looked good in a tank top anyway. Anyway, all right.
Never been my move, but thanks for having me on.
Thank you. I appreciate Greg Gottfried joining us here on CrimsonCast. Hopefully this was enjoyable. If you needed a 2-hour podcast, this is the place to come. Anyway, we'll be back with more on the Back Home Network coming up soon, including some special announcements, which we're looking forward to making. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Have a happy 4th of July if you listen to this before then. If not, have a happy 4th of July next year. For Greg, I'm Galen. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. So long, everybody.